happen. Yes, okay. So I'm Tiffany, and my topic on my master thesis is exploring the role of race and language in teacher education and using the raciolinguistic framework for multilingual and professional identities of Ontario's K-12 teacher candidates. So first of all, thank you everyone for showing up after the postal day. I know the travels to OIC is difficult, and for those who are joining on, I hope you're staying warm and safe as well. And Happy New Year and Happy New Term to everyone. So before we start, I just want to do a quick access check. For those in person, can you hear me well at the back or on the side? And for those on Zoom, can you hear me or can you see the screen well? Okay, so as long as anything happens, let me know. I will try to monitor the check in my capacity. And I also want to acknowledge the space we share together. So there are some questions that I want you to think about. You can think where you're from and who came before us, and where was this land or where you're calling from, and whose languages have you kept? Whose languages have you lost or have you silenced? So we can take some moments to think about it. Okay. And then, moving on to why am I here today? First of all, I want to give some notes of thanks. Thank you all of you for attending this presentation, either in person or online. And I want to thank my 6 participants. These are not their real names, and I will share the stories of how they picked the name later. And they're Veronica, Ceci, Cam, Sarah, Gary, and Jimmy. And they are teacher candidates. Despite their busy schedule, it was very generous of them to take their time from their break to share their insights with me. And I also want to thank my research supervisor, Professor Jeff Bell, and my committee member, Dr. Shakina Rajaham at OIC. And some of my profs and mentors at OIC are here today. Penny is my sociocultural theory prof. She taught me about how to connect sociocultural theory with second language teaching. And then Dr. Anna Bartosik here, she is my mentor in this year OIC mentorship program. And calling online, we have Yulia. Yulia taught me language awareness for language educators. I also have different friends calling from our thesis group. Soyoung and Erica, we met in the East Asia Special Interest Group at OIC. We are trying to advocate for more East Asian and West East Asians related studies. So it's in my thesis group. David is in the scholar group leading the sociocultural theory studies in Toronto. So thank you so much everyone for joining here, online or in person. And I also want to thank my family and friends, my former teachers, colleagues and students from Hong Kong, Toronto, and around the world. Some of my teachers in my undergrad told me they will join the talk a little bit, calling from Hong Kong and from US. So despite the time zones, thank you so much for making it happen. And okay, the first thing first is I want to know how many languages are there in the space we share. So for in-person, you can say it out loud. If you're joining on Zoom, you can type it on the chat. How many languages do you use regularly? 2. And can you tell me any languages that you speak?
Korean
English?
Japanese and English.
Japanese English?
Korean and English.
Korean?
English and Spanish and Portuguese.
Spanish and Portuguese and English?
English, Polish, and a bit of French.
Polish and French. And let me take a look at the chat. Yeah, some of them share Korean, Mandarin, Ukrainian, Cantonese. Yeah, so French. Yeah, for myself, I speak, my first language is Cantonese. I speak English and Mandarin regularly. And I want you to think about what does the term multilingual identities mean to you? So you can just think about it. And we will get back to these questions later in the presentation. And for today's talk, I'm we'll break it down to 5 parts. For the first one, it will be what questions am I asking? So it's related to the research context and the research questions. The second one will be what have we found in the current research and what's missing. The third part will be how did I find the answers to the questions? And then the fourth part, usually the question that I ask the most, what have you found after doing all the interviews, is what did I find and so what? And at last, the fifth part will be where do I hope to take this research in the future? So to start with the research context, you may wonder why multilingual K-12 teacher candidates in Ontario? Because despite the diverse languages and race we identify with, it's common that we tend to use English as the common language to communicate in different classrooms, in different settings, be it K-12, teacher education, or adult education classroom. And seeing this happen, there are some questions popping up in my mind, like why can't multiple languages exist in this classroom? And why are some languages got pushed aside when teaching and learning happen in this classroom? So I start to dig deeper, and I find that the context related to my professional and personal identity, and I also look at the linguistics and identity context. As last will be the policy in Ontario's K-12 teacher education. And as Shahashi mentioned in the introduction, I am a teacher by profession. I teach in Hong Kong, in Ontario. I'm also a grad student with multilingual identities of diaspora background. And maybe a year and a half ago, I was applied teaching for an adult ESL class for the first time. And I was preparing to teach the sentence pattern, don't do something. And when I was looking at the worksheets, there was a sentence I saw on the worksheets that I find it a little bit unsettling, and I will share this with you. It's the one that I highlight. Don't speak your language in class, please. And then you have to match it with the picture, speak English. And when I look at that, I find it is a little bit uninviting. And I couldn't help but wondering what it implied. And I was thinking if multilingual adult students or even younger students are not encouraged to use their languages in both language and K-12 classroom, how about multilingual teachers who feel they're not welcome to use their own languages other than English in teaching? And how many times do these teachers use English only to prevent being blamed for using another language? And I want to know how racialization and language dictate these teachers' thoughts. So that's how my research journey begins. And as most of us know, that identity in teacher education is a significant construct in shaping teachers' candidates. I'll call them TCs, professional identities, and teaching practices. And they are shaped by their teacher education programs. I will call it TEPs. You'll go to see this a lot. Their previous schooling, their practicum experience, and also their linguistics repertoires. And when I was looking at these constructs in shaping one's professional identities, I look at the literature and I find that Ophelia Garcia, she proposed a concept in 2028 called multilingual awareness, MLA. And she emphasized these awareness is not only for language teachers, but for all, so both content and language teachers. And what she said, quote, most teacher education programs pay little attention to multilingual differences, educating their teachers as if all students were native speakers of the dominant language of the nation state, unquote. And I was thinking that for a lot of TEPs in Ontario, we were treating TCs as if they were native speakers of English. So we assume learners, teachers, native speakers of English, and then the other languages they use regularly or speak got pushed aside. And pointing to the policy in Ontario's K-12 teacher education, in 2015, 11 years ago, Ontario government, they proposed a culturally inclusive classroom. So a culturally responsive and inclusive curriculum has been introduced since then. And in 2017, this one is a revised version in 2023, the Ontario College of Teachers, OCT, the governing and accreditation body of Ontario K-12 teachers, they published this resource guide to adhere to the province mandates. And they ask all 17 teacher education programs in Ontario, they need to include this component called supporting English language learners, supporting ELLs in their teacher education training. But I found that a lot of current studies only highlight the preparation for K-12 TCs to teach racially and linguistically diverse classroom. But there is little attention to how these TCs' multilingual identities intersect with their professional identities in relation to race, racialization, and language in teacher education. And since not many studies talk about TC's experience, it's worth for my study to investigate if TCs have the preparedness for taking their own multilingual identities into consideration. And which brings us to two research questions I'm asking. The first question concerning how TCs describing and understanding their own multilingual identities in relation to race, racialization, and language. I will talk about why I use racism instead of racialization instead of racism. And the second question has to do with how previous schooling and practicum experience impact the TC's understanding of their multilingual and professional identities developed during the courses and practicum in their TEPs. So here comes the second part about reviewing what we have found in current literature. And I will explain why I use the term racialized. Racialized, I learned this from a writing given by Nelson Flores in 2020. He actually got this concept from the Ontario Human Rights Commission with their publication in 2017. They emphasize that race is actually a fluid concept that is constructed socially. So using racialized instead of people of color would be more appropriate to describe this group of people. And I chose racialization instead of racism because I want to emphasize that racialization is a process of affixing tangible or sometimes imagined characteristics of racial identity to a specific groups of people. So it's questionable where this process of affixation or even the characteristics are real. Which brings us to racial linguistics. Racial linguistics is an interdisciplinary approach to look at how racialized peoples live an educational experience and how they see racism and linguicism in reality. And this focuses on people whose English is not their first language. And when I was reviewing my literature, I put them into three different parts. The first one would be race, racialization, language, and teacher education. And then teacher identities developed in teacher education. The last one, I question, in Ontario teacher education, whose classroom is it? And today, I want to focus on race, racialization, language, and in teacher education only. So if time's allow, I will talk about the other two, but I want to focus on the blue one on the left. And I found that for a lot of racialized teacher candidates and students, they are still defined by the white supremacist institutions and some standardized academic English language practices. For those who perform exceptionally well, they will be seen as exceptional among their peers, while a lot of them are still seen as deficient speakers in English because they don't look like one, they don't sound like one, so they are deficient in speaking in English. And there are also a term called raciolinguicized stereotypes of multilingual learners in Ontario. And it was found that for a lot of teacher educators and TCs in Ontario, they tend to imagine who these multilingual learners are, where they are, or where they are not to be found. And these imaginations might have extended to multilingual K-12 TCs as well. So people kind of putting stereotypes according to how they look, how they sound. Therefore, more racial linguistic studies in North America's K-12 teacher education context are needed. And after reading a body of literature, I found that they usually imagine TCs using a binary. So they will binarize TCs as white and native speakers of English. And the other group will be non-white or racialized TCs. And the discussion on raciolinguistics ideologies are not only directed to the ones on the right side, but also to the TCs on the left side, who seem to be more privileged, and because of how they look, and maybe they deem to be native speakers of English. And I was finding a quote that actually guiding TCs to explicitly reflect on their identity and position of power help them to see the diversity in their context. And therefore, I feel like more studies, which include the whole TC's populations, instead of binarizing them, are needed to understand if their racial and linguistics identities have been hidden and if their experience have been marginalized in their TEP. And I would like to clarify here that in my study, I have no intention to imply all white TCs are monolingual, as well as all racialized TCs are multilingual. Instead, I want to dive into how TCs understand their multilingual identities and investigate if any form of explicit reflection on TCs' identities would help them to resist the negative stereotypes brought by racial linguistics ideologies. And for Ontario's teacher education, I looked into the survey that OCT done a few years ago, and they found that the majority, so it's not surprising, the majority of teaching population in Ontario's K-12 classroom is still white teachers. So in that line of thought, it's possible that the majority of TCs in Ontario, they're also white. And what does it mean? I tried to find a parallel of the racialized hierarchies of languages in Ontario proposed by Higg and Patrick in 2015. And I present here with an inverted triangle. So in this racialized hierarchies, English is always put in the top, and French comes second. And their study focused on indigenous languages. They find that indigenous languages have been marginalized systemically, and they have faced injustice through historical, legal, and political forces. So there are barriers set for indigenous communities and bar them to access government services or even education. And I find that for this type of injustice, although it's incomparable, but I can find some similarities happen to the multilingual communities in Canada and also Ontario's teacher education communities. And here comes the theoretical framework for my studies, because I got the insight that more empirical studies that focus on TCs and their lived experience as individuals, as former students, as future teachers, in relation to race, racism, racialization, and language in teacher education are needed. So that's why I was using the theory proposed by Daniels and Varghese in 2020. It's about raciolinguicized teacher subjectivity. And in their framework, they find that usually the white teachers are the main focus in a lot of teacher education studies, but racialized teachers and their views got pushed aside. So they are suggesting putting racialized teachers at the focus. And I am extending a little bit from racialized teachers to racialized TCs. And I want to use this model to look at who these TCs are, how these TCs are seen and heard in teacher education studies and practice, and how this model helps us to focus on the people they interact with, especially with their students. And which brings us to the third part, is the research methods. How did I find the answers to the questions? And also the stories behind the self-selected pseudonyms. I was using a multiple case studies with maximum variation sampling to increase the likelihood to find differences and different perspectives through the participants. And when I recruit the participants, they were all from the same Ontario's TEP, but their range of divisions and their teachable subjects are different. So in Ontario's K-12 education, and in my studies, there were TCs who plan to teach primary and junior. There were also some TCs who plan to teach junior and intermediate, and some of them plan to teach in a higher level, intermediate and senior. And they have different teachable subjects, ranging from geography to law and to different subjects. And they also have different languages used. And in my 1 hour semi-structured interviews with them, in line with this study spirit of putting a focus on multilingualism and to challenge the English dominance that perpetuate in teacher education studies, I used multilingual interviewing suggested by Thomas in 2022. And this idea is to invite participants to use all their linguistic repertoires as a resource during interview. So although English was still the main language for communication during interviews, I started the interviews by inviting the participants that they can use any languages they feel comfortable with to show how they use the language in different contexts. And if they were using languages that I do not personally share, I would invite them to share a little bit more, to elaborate in English with me later. And some of the participants, they add their own languages during the interview, and it makes the interview not just English focused, but I can hear how they use the languages. And there will be some examples shown to you later. And this is a table of the 6 participants, and all their names are they chose the name themselves. And among these 6 participants, on the right column, you can find that there are at least 7 languages they use regularly. So I exclude some languages they know, but they do not use regularly in their life. And I found that most of them, they were born and educated in Canada. Only one of them came to Canada as an adult to pursue higher education. And so a lot of their previous schooling has to do with their previous experience in Canada and in Ontario. And some study in French school board or French immersion program in Ontario. And speaking of their names, I use this self-selecting pseudonym as a way to invite them to be more engaged with the content and process. And some of them told me that they choose a synonym because of a specific childhood memory. Some of them told me, I want to choose a race-neutral name. I don't want people to, they told me, I don't want people to identify me by my name. I don't want people to guess where I'm from, which race or ethnicity I'm from. I just want to choose something that's neutral. And that's interesting because I never thought that way. And it's a good conversation starter with my participants. And towards the fourth part about the findings, the question that I asked the most, in the first question of how they describe and understand their own identities, I find 3 things. The first significant finding is the TCs saw their multilingual identity as compartmentalized, like they saw it as separate, rather than a holistic multilingual repertoires. The second will be the discussion on race, racialization, and language within TEP courses can be very depending on their cohorts and depending who taught them. And the last one is the TC, they still have the perception of multilingual learners being English language learners. So English people who speak multiple languages, they must belong to the ESL program or their ELL. And we'll get to why this happened. Yeah. I'm not sure about it.
Okay, thanks.
So here I was using a model that was initially built by the Douglas Fir group, and then Higgins and Pond changed it to make it a model for multilingual teacher identities and a transdisciplinary approach to see how teacher identities intersect with their professional practice. And for the micro level, they suggest that, and I also saw this parallel, is a few participating TCs in my study, they try to engage student language and learning using students' language. So here comes a story from Gary first. So Gary, he was teaching in grade 2 and 3 classroom. And he was teaching the concept of time. And concerning the languages, there were 8 languages spoken in the classroom. So when he taught the concept of time, he introduced the concept using Persian. And there was a girl, she comes from Iran. And when she heard Persian speaking in her classroom, she was so delighted, and she couldn't wait to teach her classmate how to say that word or concept in Persian. And for Gary, it's very encouraging, and it motivated him to include his students' culture into knowledge building. So that's the micro level. And Sarah had a similar story. She told me that one day her AT told her the ESL teacher who supported the students, they were not there that day. So Sarah, because the AT knew Sarah spoke a little bit Arabic, and Sarah described her Arabic was not that fluent, but she still knows some terms, phrases, and vocab. And the AT encouraged Sarah, there is an Arabic student, speaking student. Can you talk to them, explain the task to the student? And Sarah said, I'll take the challenge. And in Sarah's word, she said she was taking broken words in Arabic, and she pointed the picture on the worksheet is a red car, and she used the Arabic red car. She pointed, and the student immediately got it. And the student, because the student understood the instructions in Arabic, the student could finish the task on their own. And for Sarah, it's something that is a small moment, but to her, she could connect her students' languages into teaching. And for the meso level, Higgins and Point, they want to emphasize that the teacher's professional identities and their own personal linguistic histories will have an impact into teachers' pedagogical choices. And Cam, she was the only TC in this studies who can connect her previous experience into and explain why she made that pedagogical choice. But for the macro level, which is constantly and actively resisting the ideologies for political, historical forces, the macro level did not happen in my study. But for Cam's case, because she grew up in a French immersion program, she found, and when she started learning translanguaging in her TEP, she find that it's possible to compare languages with similar structure. So she told me that for English, French, and Spanish, because they share similar patterns, she could use this knowledge into teaching her students the grammatical structures. But they still see their multilingual identity as compartmentalized. And some of them told me that when they were educated in Canadian classroom for too long, they start to lose their own languages and cultures. Veronica told me a story that she said she lost her language, and she only realized that when she grew up, this is who she is. And she felt like if more languages are introduced in her TEP, she can bring this knowledge to her students, and her students can learn from her mistakes. So the students are able to realize the importance of their languages and cultures, and they are able to keep them. And I also find that a reason why they compartmentalize their multilingual identities may have to do with their teacher educators. So there are teacher educators in their TEP who were a little bit demotivated. Sarah shared that she was writing her final assignment. She spent a lot of time connecting her course readings with her own diverse cultural and linguistics experiences. But when she got her feedback from her instructor, she found that her experiences were deemed unimportant. The teacher's comments were very vague, that she felt like her past experience that brought into the classroom did not really matter. But in contrast, having teacher educators who are motivating and who encourage students to take pride in their languages could make a difference. Veronica shared that she had Spanish-speaking profs in her TEP. She is the only Hispanic professors among the white teaching faculty. Veronica described these professors. She speaks in a very beautiful accent, and these professors encourage the students to appreciate their languages, and they should do the same to encourage their students in the K-12 classroom. And which move on to the very discussion about race, racialization, and language within TEP courses. A number of participating TCs told me that they found that discussion of race and TEP were not enough, and they feel like their program and their courses, they were just checking off boxes, but they were not really dive deep into what that means to their teaching, what that means to their identities. However, some TCs, they try to acknowledge the privilege their race and language bring. Sissy, she was born bilingual. She was born in a French and English speaking household. She identified herself as a white person. And when I asked her when I asked her about her job prospect after graduation, she told me that, quote, "But I also acknowledge that race isn't typically a barrier for me as I'm a white person. So that doesn't come into the play the way it may for some other people." And she acknowledged that this acknowledgement is important because when we talk about race, our race and identity, acknowledge privilege and acknowledge some prejudice that we may face, they are equally important. However, there are still some unspoken preference of English over TCs or their students' home languages. Some of them told me that for Sissy, most of her TEP professors, they told TCs not to discourage their students from speaking their home languages. But in reality, Sissy said, sometimes you do need to push them a little bit to speak the language in the school so that they can learn. So what is the language in the school? Obviously, it's English. So English still has a preference. And on that note, some racialized teachers like Gary, he shares some possible difficulties non-native TCs like him may face. He told me accent is fun in his TEP, but accent is completely another issue because he will get mocked by his students if he say a word differently, and the student will repeat the words to challenge him. So he said, I don't want this happen in my classroom if my accent happened. And he told me he considered going to speech therapy to change his accent so he would sound more native. And when I heard his sharing, it was disheartening to hear someone who wants to change his accent just to fit into an English dominant classroom. And I find that the various discussions might have to do with the TCs who were not very clear with the program roadmap. In year one, they have to do an anti-discriminatory education course, but none of the TCs were aware that when the supporting multilingual learners course happened. So Cam told me that she doesn't remember if there's a specific course for ESL, but she shared some frustration as after doing 2 practicum in her first year without any knowledge of how to support ESL children. In her own words, she thinks that's a little bit of an issue. And it's interesting that supporting ELL this course only introduced in the second year of the TC's learning, while they had to complete 2 practicum already in their first year. And I tried to find out that for multilingual learners, almost all participants use the label of student in ESL class as an equivalent to multilingual students. When I asked Veronica if her multilingual students' home languages were allowed, she recalled it's not forbidden, but it's not encouraged. So there's a gray area between using a home language of a student in teaching. And I find that many TCs, they still have a firm belief that multilingual student learning is the responsibility of ESL or English Literacy Development ELA teachers. It is a tension that is found in current literature that many teacher educators and current teachers and even TCs, they find that if they have a multilingual student in their classroom, it's someone else's job to translate the class materials for them, but not their own responsibility. There's a clear divide between who does what. And And I find that they still saw people, the TC, they still saw people with multilingual identities with the assumption that they're using other languages that are not English, but the other languages are grouped in as an ambiguous grouping. So I am bringing this back because this racialized hierarchies of languages happened in TC's mindset. They found that the languages students speak is the languages they use at home. It has nothing to do with English or French teaching in the classroom. And for immigrant languages, this term is actually used by Statistics Canada, at least in 2017. They tried to group 14 languages used by 100,000 people in Canada, immigrant languages. So this ambiguous grouping of languages might have passed on to Ontario's K-12 TCs as they were not able to tease out different languages used by the students or even used by themselves. And for the second question about the previous schooling and practicum experience, I find that they have played an important role in shaping their multilingual and professional identities. Actually, a lot of them told me that they find that comparing to their courses, practicum is where race and language got discussed and they can experience in the first hand. So I'll start with previous schooling experience. Since some of my participants, they were educated in French immersion or French school board, they told me that actually the acceptance of French languages is wider than we imagine. So Sissy, she grew up in a French school board when she was young, and she noticed that her previous teacher, who were from Congo, France, Quebec, Ontario, or other French-speaking countries, they speak a different French, they have different vocabulary, different accent, but they can coexist in French school boards. And it's very encouraging to her because right now, when she did her practicum, she also finds a similar acceptance to everyone's French is different. But this mindset of accepting everyone's English is different cannot be found in classroom. So most of the TC in this city, they still see English as a static, standardized language. It cannot be challenged. This is the way it is. And from previous school experience, some teachers realized that they kind of took English for granted in the past. So Jimmy is an intermediate and senior teacher. He teaches English, and he is also learning Russian on the side. And he was connecting his grade 12 experience with his current experience teaching grade 11 students. When he was in grade 12, he said his teacher was so shocked when she asked her class, like Jimmy and his classmate, have you heard part of speech? And none of his classmates heard part of speech when they were in grade 12. And the teacher spent time to tell them in English, we have subject, verb, object. And from that moment on, Jimmy said it kind of changed his understanding of what language looks like. And he is more aware of grammatical system. So right now, as a teacher who needs to teach English to grade 11, grade 12 students, he found that he will pause and he will reflect how does it actually work? So he connects his past experience to his current teaching. And however, there are some teachers, they share how they got sidelined and pushed aside in the past, and they have negative experience. So Sarah recalled when she learned English as a language, there were embarrassing moments happening to her because she needs to be pulled out of a mainstream classroom. And she was sent to an ESL class. And when she was being pulled away, she knows that some of her classmates said, she's special. She's weird. She doesn't learn with us. And she felt like being taken to ESL class is like being put a label on her, on how different she was. And in the ESL classroom, she was pushed to repeat files and articulation again and again, so to fit into that box. So as a teacher right now, she doesn't want it to happen to any of her students anymore. And connecting to practicum experience and their interaction with their associate teachers, ATs, who are the in-service teachers providing support and evaluation in their practicum schools, 100% of the TC said they had very supportive ATs. They encourage them to use multilingual languages. The ATs themselves, a lot of them are even multilingual teachers, so change are happening. And the TCs found that they were able to connect with their students using multiple languages. Gary, he is a Mandarin speaker, and he said when he was sent to his practicum school at the beginning, there was a girl in his classroom. She was maybe 6 to 7 years old. She just moved to Canada with her family. She did not speak a lot of English, and she had big emotions because she felt like no one could understand her. And Gary's AT noticed, oh, Gary, you speak Mandarin, and this teacher also speaks Mandarin. Why don't you talk to her in Mandarin? Not to teach her anything, but just to talk to her to see how she can be support. And Gary took the challenge and he asked the girl in Mandarin, you can just tell me how you feel. If you have any question, you can ask me in Mandarin. You don't have to force yourself to speak in English. And Gary said at the end of the practicum, the girl, she had better emotional regulation. She felt she was being understood by her teachers in the classroom because there were adults who were willing to understand her talking despite the languages she used. And these positive changes can be seen across different TC's accounts. And
If you can have a big few minutes.
yeah. And but I find that there are still deficit or oriented lens by some in-service teachers. These in-service teachers are not the ATs, but some of the teachers feel like multilingual teachers equal to immigrant students, and they come to Canada for a better living, and they need to learn English to better their life. So it's quite sad to see this happening. So there's some limitations because I interview these TCs while they're in their first year. I could not really compare their 2 years experience. And I find that there are some implications that I could do to make it better. Likely, for example, I have to revise the model because the current model, I find it mainly focused on the racialized teachers and then the interaction with their students. So I find that to learn from a different model in language classroom called participative multilingual identity, it's important to see how one's multilingual identity is mediated by others. So the interaction between racialized and other racialized teachers, interaction between white and white teachers, between racialized and white teachers, and also interaction among cohorts, profs, and ATs are important. And these relational and social domains should be focused. And for pedagogical implication, the first few questions that I asked you at the beginning, this is a question that should be asked to TCs right at the beginning instead of waiting in the second year or in the middle of their TEP. I find that introducing the term of multilingual learners, multilingual identities, translanguaging at an earlier stage would be better. And I find that teacher educators, they can co-develop teaching resources with all their TTs. They can bring in their languages to write teaching resources and material together. So they can do it before practicum, apply during practicum, and then evaluate together after practicum. So at last, where do I hope to take this research in the future is I find that TEP should meet TCs at where they are, who they're going to teach. So TEPs in Ontario have to be up to date because there's changing climate of race, racialization, and language. And this discussion have been pushed aside, have been taken for granted for a long time. So it's time to bring it back to the focus of education studies. And I hope to take any, it often have a glitch. Okay, so if you have any thoughts about my master research or if any collaboration ideas in mind, here's my U of T email and my LinkedIn. And I have included a QR code here. It includes my notes of thanks to different people, and there's a long list of references. So please feel free to scan it. And I would like to to respect everyone's time, I want to end this presentation with my second language, English first. Thank you very much. And end it with my first language, Cantonese. 多謝大家. Thank you so much for participation. Thank you.